in this episode of the Critical Oxygen Podcast.
So for me, I was definitely taking between 90 and 120 grams. Most runners I work with, we do try to get them close to 90 or little, depending, male or female, obviously it's going to be a little different. And obviously the duration that you're running is going to change that too.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Critical Oxygen Podcast, where we help you optimize your physiology and maximize your athletic potential. I'm your host, Phil Batterson, and today we're joined by continuing guest host, Coach Jonah Rosner, where we're going to talk about fueling your running. Jonah, welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, Phil. Excited to be back on.
Yeah, man, it's been a while, and I think in terms of episodes, it's probably like a 10 or 20 episode gap, honestly, between
big gap.
Yeah, between our talks. So, we have a little bit of stuff to talk about. I think the last time we touched base, you were just about to set off for the Philly Marathon, and I want to allow the listeners to get a little bit of a recap of the Philly Marathon and everything. So I'll let you kind of give us a recap, and then we can kind of go from there.
Yeah, no, 100%. Yeah, it's been a minute. I went up to Philadelphia, ran the marathon. Actually, third mile in, stepped into, unfortunately, a pothole, which messed up my ankle pretty bad. So I got my foot and ankle pretty bad. Then, of course, made the decision to continue to run 23 miles after that, which has now led to a lot of effects after. I've yet to get any official imaging or anything done, but still in a bit of a pain in the ankle foot area, a lot of nerve stuff, it seems like. So been running here or there, not a ton, kind of stopped that completely now, and just letting it let some of the pain subside. Doing a lot of cross training, a lot of lifting, and soon we'll get back into it. I think I got plans for the spring for some halves and then back into the marathon again. But honestly, it was still an unbelievable experience, and I gained a ton of fitness from that marathon build. So ready to hit it again. It wasn't exactly obviously the way you want it to go, but I think that's probably why I like the sport a lot too. Just there's a lot on the line, and sometimes it doesn't go well, and you got to just be willing to fight back.
Yeah, and we had been talking, the lead up to the marathon and everything, and you were like, "Oh yeah, I just did a casual, 28 miler or something like that."
That was good.
So it's not like your fitness wasn't there for it.
No, it was there. I was putting 80 miles a week peak, 80, 90. So it was a crazy experience to do that, but here we are.
Yeah. And your body, other than, kind of this freak, kind of ankle injury, it was holding up pretty well.
Oh yeah, my body, I don't know if it's from all the years of heavy lifting and all that stuff, or it seems to respond pretty well to stuff. I was tired, no doubt, from running that many miles, but I was getting by. No injuries.
Yeah. Yeah, that's something that I've been recognizing with cycling for me, is that I generally, until freak incident, early last week where I kind of tweaked my back and then, things kind of went downhill, was able to actually absorb so much intensity and duration, with the cycling. And it was just something that was it felt really good, because in running, I never really was able to absorb that volume and frequency of training. But yeah, I think there is something to say about the strength training for sure. That is something that I think people do not put enough emphasis on. And those that have done, long blocks of extended heavy strength training, I think are very, very, I'm going to use the term durable, but not durable from the perspective of not losing critical power over time. But your body can just handle more of a beating.
100%. I think it's durability across multiple senses. Your body can bounce back quicker, but also even in race durability, that classical stuff you were talking about. There seems to be some interesting literature emerging.
Yeah, and that's why I think our last episode, of this recording that we published was resilience, and that's why I like the word resilience, because 100%. Durability again is kind of how much can you beat yourself up and still be able to absorb load and do other things like that. Whereas resilience, I don't know. It's so hard, and we'll probably never have one definition, going forward. But whatever.
No, yeah, exactly.
Cool, man. So I think today what I really want to focus on is fueling for running. You were posting a lot of things leading up to the marathon about the copious amounts of carbohydrates that you were intaking prior to or during training, prior to training, and then during the race itself. So I want to touch on this because I think runners especially are pretty bad at fueling. And I want to just get your take on, what you think the recommendation should be, even for, like for different classes of runners, like how many should we
Yeah.
intake? So let's start with, what was your approach in terms of carbohydrate intake, and what was kind of like the research or like the foundational knowledge that you were taking behind that to support, pushing those carbohydrates so high?
Yeah, I think I have a few points to make. I mean, first of all, I think you hit the nail on the head. The reason I started really targeting it and a lot of my content and what I talked about was because it's so underappreciated by runners. And so I thought there was a huge opportunity there where most runners were underfueling their training and racing. And then from the same time, that's kind of the approach I took, where I thought that having adequate carbohydrate fueling and obviously all the other macronutrient fueling was going to be important from a few standpoints. One, I think you could say in race performance. It's going to help me maintain like my speed in race, probably not go through some of that fatigue that potentially could come up, like some of the fatigue resistant stuff, durability, whatever you want to call it.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's also going to like the carb load the few days before the race or the day before the race, we know can help performance in the race. And then also just within training, I think is something that people get wrong. Not only practicing the fueling in training so you're ready for the race, but also supporting your training. Like we know
Mm-hmm.
training volume and also combined with some level of intensity is a really important factor for success in endurance performance events. Running for sure. Like we know that best marathoners are taking in a lot of training volume.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it can't be I think it's important that we recognize that proper fueling is important for proper training volume. If you want to recover well, which is going to allow you to accumulate more volume, you need to be fueling those runs before the run, in the run, and after the run. That's going to allow you to accumulate more volume, which is a huge factor for performance. So that's kind of the approach I took. I think people, because I took it to the extremes, thought I was fueling more than I actually was. I would say most of the times I was doing any kind of fueling for training was doing log runs and like higher intensity sessions that were longer. The
Mm-hmm.
shorter duration, high intensity sessions, I actually would mostly just have carbohydrates the night before or beforehand. But when I was fueling like the long runs and my race day strategy, if it went well, was essentially to push the upper limits, which I know my stomach could handle because from practicing. But then
Mm-hmm.
also what some of the literature is showing. Obviously, we see that it get thrown around like you can handle up to 120 grams per hour. I think obviously now we have some mixed stuff about that too, where does that actually increase the exogenous carbohydrate utilization? We don't know. Seems like a lot of stuff like has still set it on more than we originally thought. But most runners I talked to, like we're taking in between 45 to maybe 60
Mm-hmm.
grams per hour, where I think we do have decent evidence that up to 90 or around 90 is definitely something that's going to help performance. So for me, I was definitely taking between 90 and 120 grams. Most runners I work with, we do try to get them close to 90 or little, depending, male or female, obviously it's going to be a little different. And obviously the duration that you're running is going to change that too. If you're completing a marathon a lot faster, you may be able to push higher carbs per hour, but at the same time, you're not going to need as many as long because you're going to finish quicker. Or
Mm-hmm.
vice versa, if you're running for 4 hours, you're going to need to have more total carbohydrates because you're just running for a longer duration,
Right.
but maybe you don't oxidize them as quickly. So that's essentially the approach I was taking, where for me personally, just to really answer the question, 90 grams per hour, close to 120 grams per hour, sometimes somewhere in that range. And I would definitely have it for like the first and second hour to 2.5 hours. And then because I was finishing around 3 hours for a lot of those long runs, like practicing race demands, last little 20, 30 minutes, I wasn't really fueling.
Yeah. Yeah. When I was training for my ultra marathon back in May, I was trying during my long runs to hit between 90 and 120. I think the highest I ever got was really like 100 grams per hour, just because it was more of a palate thing for me. But I
Yeah.
really do think, and there is evidence to support this, that higher carbohydrate intake, especially during those higher output demands, actually reduce things like inflammation or other markers of damage and other things like
Yeah.
that. And I think that is something that is very underappreciated, is that the less.
That's the biggest factor for me.
Yeah, yeah, right. It's like, you're fueling, and this is something I think we talked about this, but it's something I've been thinking about. Is it the carbohydrates, or is it more the lessening the caloric deficit?
Yeah.
I think it's a combination of both, just because carbohydrates
Yeah.
are an easy source of fuel to digest. But I really think mitigating that big roller coaster of a caloric
The
deficit,
energy deficit. Yeah.
yeah, is plays a huge factor or huge role in your ability to recover from day to day.
Yeah. That's why I think like practicing in the long runs leading up to the race was huge because I just felt like I was more recovered when I was fueling those very well. and I could get back to higher quality training that next week.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, you can't, the longer you're waiting for recovery to happen, say if it's, 2-3
Exactly.
days, between your long run, if you could accelerate that recovery by intaking more carbohydrates during your actual run, yes, you may be blunting the adaptations just very, very slightly. But if you can get back to doing it in a day rather than 3 days, I think,
Yeah.
right, proof is in the pudding there, right? If you the more consistent and the more specific and progressive you can be, the better off you're going to be in terms of your training, anyways.
100%.
I see it all the time on subreddits, like cycling subreddits, where it's like, oh, I'm going for like 3 or 4 hour long rides in zone 2, and people are like, oh yeah, you don't need to fuel, for those, because zone 2 riding is like so low and all of that. I'm like, no, if anything, those longer ones you should be fueling, because you're running such a caloric deficit that you're
Yeah.
setting yourself up for for failure or for challenges later in the day.
Yeah, I think that's what people advise too. Like they say, oh, like I'm completing a longer duration easy run. I hear that all the time. I don't need to fuel. I can do it fasted. It's like, no, like those, even though they're not at a high intensity, because it's such a long duration, you're utilizing most of your glycogen stores, maybe
Mm-hmm.
not at as fast of a rate. But if you want to get the most out of like a 2-3 hour run or training, whatever training session it is, like that needs to be fueled too.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, and I think too, cycling and running are different sports in a sense. Or
100%.
no, they are. One of them is weight bearing. One of them
Yeah, the
is
mechanical
non-weight
loading.
bearing. So you're going to be creating a lot more damage when you're running too. And like, I know people, like people have made, like fasted cardio, a thing. And there are some things to say. There were some studies that were released probably like in the mid 2000s that were talking about low glycogen training after like a high intensity day. You wouldn't refuel with glycogen, then you'd come back and you'd do a fasted cardio workout, and then they saw, better adaptations compared to those that ate. But at the same time, we have to remember that some of that research was looking at 4 weeks of training, right, at that at that low glycogen sort of thing. And
Yeah, that's actually my next Instagram video. Fasted training. Like I'm not a huge fan of it for marathoners,
mm-mm.
especially marathoners who are accumulating a ton of volume. And that's because, like, first of all, doing a lot of those sessions that they're higher intensity sessions, even if they are fueling them, they'll get that glycogen depletion anyway, which could theoretically cause enhanced signaling for those aerobic pathways.
Right.
But at the same time, like, I think for them, I would much rather be able to accumulate a lot of volume, which is the most important factor. And I think to accumulate a lot of volume, you need to be fueled.
Yeah. Yeah. Anybody, it's different if you're approaching it from maybe a wellness perspective or something. And
Yeah,
yes, if you're looking at the biomolecular signaling pathways, you do get more upregulation of certain proteins within
definitely.
pathways and stuff. But at the same time, number one, is that enhanced signal actually translating to enhanced performance down the road? We
It's
don't know.
mixed. Yeah.
Yeah, it's mixed. And we don't know because a lot of these training periods are very acute bouts, 3, 4, 5, maybe 8 weeks of
Yeah.
training. And then on top of it too, again, and this is something that you and I have talked about a ton, is consistency over everything. If you're constantly in a state of depleted glycogen, you're going to increase your immune response and potentially, weaken your immune system at the same time, letting yourself open to get sick. And I know people who do this, who are like, oh, I do fasted cardio all the time. I'm doing 80 miles a week and I'm constantly getting sick. It's like, well, that's not the consistency we want. We don't want you consistently being sick. We want you consistently being able to exercise. That's even like for me, like I like to work out early-ish in the morning. So like I get up, drink my coffee, and then typically don't really eat. So the first time I do eat is I actually start eating like 20 or 30 minutes into my bike ride or into my run. And I don't do that because there's these magical benefits of waiting 30 minutes or whatever it is, but I need to eat during my hour and a half bike rides, because if I don't, then I'm already in like almost a 900 calorie deficit going into my day. And then having to make up for that later in the day, it's really, really tough to stay on top of your calories, especially if you're over that like 3,000 to 3,500 calories per day mark. if you're not eating or fueling during your actual workouts.
No, I couldn't agree more. I've had the same thing with a lot of the runners I work with where just for convenience sake, they want to work out first thing in the morning, which I understand, and they just don't get any calories in beforehand, which some of the sessions are long, so that can make it tough. And I think the main factor, the main variable I like to look at, that you brought up, which I think is the extra point, is the volume. Like if
Mm-hmm.
you're running 80 miles a week, or if you're accumulating any kind of decent volume, the low carbohydrate or glycogen depleted training just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But let's say you are a time crunch athlete and you're not running that much and you're already accumulating a ton of volume and you're trying to maximize all the adaptations you could get, or performance isn't exactly your goal, then maybe the faster training makes more sense when there's lower volume.
Yeah, I think too it's important to note that it's like we're talking about half marathon runners.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe runners that are doing 10Ks and 5Ks and stuff as well, but people who are accumulating a lot of volume in order to do a race that's 3.5 hours or less, more or less. Because when you start to get out into, maybe like the ultra running or the Ironmans, the half Ironmans, then maybe there is
It's
a
an important
place.
distinction. Yeah.
Yeah. But at the same time, I don't know. I still can't really get behind it because I just think that the stress does not outweigh the benefits. You're just accumulating much more stress versus let's play the slow game. It's the same thing with like increasing volume as well. Like I was talking to somebody who was saying, or I can't remember. No, maybe I was just listening to a podcast, but they were talking about, like the general rule for volume is no more than 10% per week. But in all actuality, 1 to 5% might be a little bit better because you're still increasing your volume. You're able to absorb those adaptations, other things like that. And, maybe if you're going along, if you're inching forward a little bit slower than, like doing all the optimal stuff. Like, for example, if you really wanted to stimulate, as much mitochondrial biogenesis as possible, you would do fasted training after a glycogen depleting high intensity interval training workout the day before, and then you would go immediately and you jump into a hot or a hot shower or a sauna or something like that, followed by a cold plunge, followed by another hot, it's like, so yes, that would accumulate a buttload of stress and increase those stress signals. But at the same time, your ability to actually accumulate and adapt to that stress is going to diminish very, very quickly. So you have to kind of pick your battles. And again, remember that, researchers are trying to we're trying to detect really small changes. So we need really, really big stimuli in order to actually get those changes to occur over 3 or 4 weeks. So this is like one of the rifts, right, between like the coaching and the research aspects of things. Is like we have so much research that's like, oh, if you do this, this, and this, you're going to get, like the best signaling, possible. But then from a coaching perspective, we're like, yeah, but you don't have to do all of that. Just like, I think you just posted something that was like proximity to failure in terms of strength training. And it's like, you don't need to go to failure on your strength training because yes, it will enhance your signaling, but it's not worth it because of the fatigue that you're accumulating.
Yeah, exactly. And you brought up some excellent points there. I mean, that's a good example of it. And I think it's important to bring up what we're talking about, like increasing training load. A lot of those percentages were just arbitrary. Like we don't know how much those numbers actually matter. And it's more just about good training progressions, I would say. And probably something that is really important to look at is like the amount of volume you were taking on beforehand, because a 10% increase when you have a ton of volume is different than when you have a little amount of volume, right?
And that's always something that I've kind of struggled with, is because people do, coaches do kind of throw that 10% rule out there. And it's like, okay, well, if you're increasing 10% and you only run 5 miles a week, that's like 5 miles, 5.5 miles, that's like nothing. Whereas, if you are already doing 100 miles, an extra 10 miles on top of that, that's like another run. That's another decent sized run. So again, it's context and then content. It's like you have to know your athlete, know yourself if you're a self-coached athlete, and then build off of those sort of things. So let's get back to fueling. Speaking of building, so the general recommendation that I see thrown around by nutritionists is like 30 to 90 grams of carbohydrates, depending on how long the duration is, how far you're going, other things like that. And, for the most part, the general recommendation is that if you're exercising less than an hour, you don't really need to intake carbohydrates. Yeah, I think that's totally fine. If you're doing, but at the same time, again, if we're trying to avoid a calorie deficit, in an hour, you can still burn a lot of calories. You can still burn anywhere from 600 to 1,000 calories, depending on how fast you're going. Those calories have to come from somewhere. And most likely, even if you are at zone 2, you're probably still burning a large majority of carbohydrates. So I would say that even like those hour workouts, like for example, I've been starting to get my hour workouts, my zone 2 hour workouts to like 180 to 200 watts. And that's like 750 calories worth of work with, it says on my testing stuff that it's only 66 grams of carbohydrate, per hour. But at the same time, it's much easier to intake carbohydrates than it is to intake like a carbohydrate fat mixture in terms of like, making your stomach feel okay. So what I like to do is I like to, if I know that I have like hard workouts coming up or just trying to avoid that calorie deficit, I'm still intaking like 90 grams of carbohydrates, even though I know that I'm not going to technically be burning all of those carbohydrates. I'll just burn those later on in the day. If they're still circulating in my system, they'll go towards glycogen, or they'll go towards fueling if there is an insulin increase, later on after I'm done fueling. But it's mitigating that caloric deficit. So that's something that I don't know, I think about, and I really just think that anything 30 to 60 is like, that's pretty darn low.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I also think like a lot of athletes you and I are talking about, these higher level athletes are accumulating so much training volume that a lot of them, ones I work with as of now, it's never really an issue of eating too many calories
Right.
or overfueling. It's mostly the opposite. So if they're intaking a little more during that easy hour run than they technically need, for me, it's never really a big deal. Like a lot of times those carbohydrates get put to good use in other scenarios or in future trainings. But you brought up two key points that are really important to me, that I think we should harp on. Number one is like, yeah, like if it's less than 60, 90 minutes, whatever, you going with fully with glycogen, with 4 levels of glycogen for an easy run, you're probably not going to deplete your glycogen.
Mm-mm.
That's like typically a rule of thumb I use too. If it's like a 60-minute run, we don't need to worry about in-run fueling. The one reason, as you alluded to, where we might consider in-run fueling is what does the next few days look like?
Mm-hmm.
It's not only about what that run looks like, it's about what the next few days of training look like. And if we're saying, hey, like tomorrow you got a really important key session, or the next day after, if we got a quick turnaround before another intense session, even though that's an easy run, let's actually focus on fueling in that easy run, not only for that run, but just to set up the next few days. And so you're recovering from that. That's how I would look at it.
Yeah. And that, so then you start to get into, okay, well, when would it be appropriate then to start doing like, 90 to 120 grams of carbohydrates? Because it's still such a foreign idea, I think, to a lot of people to be like, oh my gosh, I need to, like, taking in 90 grams of carbohydrates is a significant, it's a task, right? You got to prep your bottles, you got to make sure, you got to get your goos and other things like that, especially with running, right? You'd have to have your vest and all of that. So I would say, it's like when you start to approach that, 90 plus minute mark, obviously, if you've never fueled with carbohydrates before, you're not going to start at 90 grams because there is significant risk of gastrointestinal issues, meaning you're going to have stomach aches, cramping, potential diarrhea, which will make you run faster, but probably not along the path, more towards the porta potty. And then, so you're going to want to start at something that is like relatively low. My progression was, during my ultra running, I started with like just a bottle of Gatorade every hour. And I think that was around 60 grams of carbohydrates or something like that. Then what I would do is I started to bump that up, and I switched over to the Morton gel, or like the Morton packets that would mix into a water bottle. And then in order to get up to the 90, I'd splash in a little bit of Gatorade. So I do that, and then I would start doing more of the mixture, less water, more Gatorade, to try to get to that, 100, 110 grams of carbohydrates per hour. And there is something to say about training your gut in order to be able to absorb the carbohydrates. It's not something you're going to do right away, and it does take time, just like training and training volume takes time, but you can definitely get your body or give your body the ability to get better at absorbing carbohydrates. So that's kind of how I progressed. It was like kind of on a week to week basis. I would just increase the carbohydrates just a little bit. That's not a very scientific way. A little bit. What does that mean? But that was generally how I approached it. Jonah, when you were getting into, your marathon training, how did you approach kind of that like progressive overload of carbohydrate loading?
Yeah, I would use I would have one key long run a week or every 2 weeks, depending on the microcycle periodization scheme, and I would use that. And essentially, I started out very similar to you, very low, like 30 grams per hour. And then I slowly just built up like every week or two long runs, 40
Mm-hmm.
grams, 50 grams. I tried to move right away to the actual substance I would have in the marathon. So the morning is what I used.
Yep.
So I practiced with the exact substance I would. I tried taking them in the exact same time period, which was my plan for the race. So I'd be like 5K, for example,
Mm-hmm.
or like every 20. I prefer the strategy of like slowly carbs rather than going with like a 40-gram gel at one time. I think from GI stress, that tends to do better. So, yeah, I mean, I think if we just talk about rules of thumb, there's a good paper about this too. It's just essentially practicing it in the way that you're going to do in the race and slowly build up the amount.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, the framework I did was very similar to you. Like the timing was the same in regards to like every 5K from the first time I did it. And then, but just like starting off with only like a smaller amount of the carbs and then slowly increasing till I got to the rate that I wanted of the
Mm-hmm.
carbohydrate ingested. So I think I started at, like you said, like 30 grams per hour, then 40, 50, and eventually worked my way up to 90 and never really had any GI issues. I think if I went to 90 right away, I would have had trouble.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I think, my number one mistake when I was doing my Ironman back in 2012 was I didn't realize that, gut tolerance and other things like that were actually a thing. This was before I had any training in physiology or anything like that. I was a mechanical engineer, just kind of like told that I would be good at doing Ironman, so I just did one. And on the bike, it was like a Gatorade and a banana every single aid station, and I
Yeah.
think that was too much because what ended up happening is I got to the run. I was feeling good for about 13 miles or so and, was doing the same sort of intake, just as many carbohydrates as I could. And then eventually everything started cramping up, stomach hurt, all that sort of stuff. And I do think that, I overdid it on the carbohydrates, but that was because I didn't practice what I actually did in the race. So it is one of those things like, practice the things that you're doing. And it's the same thing as like, for example, if you do, only polarized training and then you go to run a marathon and you're running marathon at a pace that you've really never run or focused on, that pace is not going to be comfortable or efficient for you. Just like if you go and you take your, your gels or you don't do gels or anything like that, then on race day, you're like, oh, well, the course is supplying me with, goo blocks or something. So I'm going to eat 4 of those every time I see them. You're setting yourself up for a lot of potential, risks, and it's just most likely not going to end well. Just to continue that, so we've touched on kind of like how to progress your carbohydrates, how to practice your carbohydrate intake. Oh, something in terms of time wise that I really like to do is I have a timer on my watch set for every 15 minutes. And every 15 minutes, it goes off, and that's my time to drink about a quarter of my water bottle. So if you're bringing water bottles or whatever it is, that's what I preferred. Then drink a quarter of your water bottle, and then continue on. And I think there was a study that was published. They're looking at different time frames of consumption, and I think like the 15 to 30 minute mark, was kind of like enough to break it up and not have or mitigate your risks of gastrointestinal issues. It's keeping more of a slow drip on the carbohydrates rather than, like you said, just slamming slamming a gel every hour, which I think hitting the system with that many carbohydrates, your body may just not be able to absorb that many as the in the time that it takes to actually like have all of those carbohydrates pass through your small intestine. Because really, like the reason why you get stomach issues or gastrointestinal issues is those carbohydrates making their way into the large intestine. When they make it into the large intestine, if there's carbohydrate there, bacteria in your intestine love that stuff, and they just go crazy and they produce a lot of gas. That production of gas is what, is probably one of the reasons why you get gastrointestinal distress if you have too many carbs.
Yeah, no, 100%. That's the whole thing too. It's about finding that balance for me, and a lot of it's based on the individual, and it can be a bit of a balance with them about finding that right give and take between the amount of carbohydrates they can handle per hour. That's not going to cause GI stress, but also the ones they can oxidize or whatever, make the most use of. So I think we're going to be super practical with it. Like it's that law of specificity, which you and I talked about for training, but it applies
Mm-hmm.
for fueling too. Like when I'm working with someone now, we're just very specific with the fueling from the standpoint, as soon as we can, let's use the exact products you're going to use on race day, not switch up the product. Let's get the timing right, and then the exact timing of how often we want to do it on the long run. And then let's slowly build up the amount with each ingestion.
Mm-hmm. I know it's crazy how this idea of consistency, specificity, and progression, just plays
Applies across.
yeah,
Yeah.
applies for everything, right? So no, that's really good. So let's transition, because now you see the sensationalization of carbohydrate intake, right? I see it a lot in the cycling community where it's like, oh, the carvolution or something like that. I don't know. That was like one of the most recent.
Yeah, I saw that paper or that
Yeah,
article.
yeah, one of the most recent, I don't even know, posts where they're just like, oh, are you, should you be eating all these carbohydrates? And, you know, I think from what we have in the literature, 90 grams of carbohydrates seems
Agreed.
seems to be kind of like that optimal level that people should strive for. And anything over that, we don't really know what the benefits or decrements in, performance, adaptations, other things like that are, because there's just not simply enough literature out there to say one way or the other that taking that many carbohydrates is a benefit. That doesn't mean that it's not possible, and it doesn't mean that it's not helping us. We just don't have enough. We're just limited on the research, because when this whole idea of carbohydrate intake for performance was coming out, there are papers that were showing that at most you could really only ingest 60 grams of glucose, and then you could boost that up a little bit more with adding fructose, which is another simple sugar that's transported differently within your intestines. So by adding glucose and fructose together, you can actually get up to 90 grams. But these were, we have to remember, most if not all of these research studies were based off of single acute bouts of injecting people with the solution. So they had an IV with the glucose fructose solution, and then they would have people ride, and then they'd measure their oxidation based on a indirect calorimetry mask. So these are all acute bouts, but there's so many papers and articles and stuff that actually suggest your body's ability to actually upregulate transporters that will take more glucose, take more fructose over the gut barrier. So there is potential for more carbohydrate to actually be absorbed and utilized. But then you also have to think about, well, what's then what's limiting your ability to actually oxidize the carbohydrates? Is it transport of those carbohydrates to the muscle? Is it the mitochondria, having enough enzymes to actually burn them, and other things like that? And we largely don't know. So there was an article that was published that was like the carvolution, and it was talking about how people in the peloton for cycling were consuming upwards of 120 to 150 grams of carbohydrates. And again, we don't know if there is true benefit to it, but if everybody is doing that, and if people seem to be getting benefit from it, anecdotally speaking, then maybe there is something to say about pushing those carbohydrates even higher. I, again, am coming from a little bit more of a cycling background right now, and it makes sense. If you're not jostling yourself, if you're just riding on a bike, your body probably isn't, or probably is a little bit more capable of digesting carbohydrates. So that 120 to 150, it might be specific to cycling. But I think with running, and Jonah, you can speak to this, I think with running that 90 to 120 grams of carbs, I don't think, if you have built up your tolerance, I don't think it's going to necessarily hurt your performance.
Yeah, I've heard the argument that potentially if you go above 90 and you don't actually oxidize the carbs and like they just sit there, and could that potentially hurt your performance, whatever, sitting in the stomach, adding weight? I don't know. I can't imagine it's going to alter it too much. It's definitely not my specific area of expertise. I don't know if anyone knows, right? As you alluded to.
Right.
But I can't imagine that going closer to 120, if you can handle it without GI stress, it's going to hurt. And like you said, I think we do have some interesting literature that did come out that if it is like a course or something that would cause high levels of neuromuscular damage or fatigue, that potentially getting to 120 and running can help offset that, which could help future training and recovery.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was one study that was done, I think, in ultra runners where they gave them like
Mountain,
60, 90, and 120 grams, and they did a marathon. And
yeah,
these individuals, it's like they measured. They didn't actually come out, I don't think, with the performance metrics, which is a bit of a bummer because I would have liked to see.
It was like muscle damage and fatigue.
Yeah, it was like creatine kinase in the blood or something like that, right?
Yeah.
Or creatinine or something along those lines, some marker of muscle damage. And the amount of muscle damage with the 120 gram per hour group was much, much, much lower than the 90 gram per hour and the 60 gram per hour. So, even if it's not improving your performance, but if you plan on staying consistent and being somebody who races for a really, really long time, then, it is something to consider. And, so back to that idea though of, oh, well, if you're intaking too many carbohydrates, some people say like, oh, well, you might have an insulin, an increase in insulin within your blood, and then increase in insulin would then push more carbohydrates to be oxidized, which could then get rid of your ability to actually oxidize fats at the same time, which could then, lead to your body having a mismatch. So then when you run out of carbohydrates, then you're kind of just SOL. So I understand that from an integrated physiology perspective, but from what we see with the amount of insulin that's actually produced with carbohydrate intake or just with exercise in general, is you almost have no insulin in your blood when you're exercising.
Yep.
You would have to take a lot of a lot of carbohydrates in order for an insulin response to happen, and you would have to have elevated blood glucose for extended periods of time in order for that to happen as well. So, or not even extended periods, but just you'd have to have a really high amount of glucose within the blood, because what's really cool is that your muscles are actually able to regulate and absorb carbohydrates from your blood, regardless of insulin in the blood, especially during contraction. So if you're doing high exertion, activity like running, then you're going to upregulate or stimulate glucose pull into the muscle, and that doesn't require insulin to actually be there. So that's the way that I would think about it. I don't think that it's necessarily I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. Obviously, if you're not used to it, if you're not ready for it, then probably not. But again, it also depends on how quickly you're going, how slow you are. Male, female, there seems to be some differences in carbohydrate and then necessity for carbohydrate or exogenous carbohydrate. So all of those things play into account. Jonah, do you have anything else to add on that? If not, we can go into that modeling paper.
No, I think that you covered it right there.
Cool. So the reason why I mentioned this, sex differences, size differences, duration differences, is because there was a really cool paper that just came out of my master advisor's lab, Dr. Robbie Jacobs, who's a continuing guest host on this podcast, as well as Brett Kirby was on the paper. He was the physiologist for the Nike Breaking 2 project, like the lead physiologist. And then Dr. Jacobs' master's student kind of led the charge. It's a super good paper, pretty darn dense because it is modeling. So, they really explain where they're getting all of their assumptions from, all of their data, all of that sort of stuff. But basically what they were trying to do is they were trying to figure out what the amount of exogenous carbohydrate intake would be needed for males and females in order to actually run a 2-hour marathon. Now, I know that a 2-hour marathon is probably a little bit more intense than most of us listening to this podcast, if not everybody. But at the same time, it was an exercise in figuring out, are the general nutritional recommendations adequate for elite level athletes? So what the authors did, and Robbie and I are actually going to get on the podcast, and we're going to do like a Journal Club article all about, or a Journal Club podcast all about this article. But
sick.
yeah, it's going to be fun. So I'm going to get the author on it to actually, talk to me about, where they came up with the idea and all of that. But what they were trying to do, or what they did, is they took the anthropometrics of elite level marathon runners, males and females, and then they basically just like kept digging into the research. How much lean body mass is there? What would be the amount of glycogen stored in the liver, in the muscles, based on, DEXA scans from similar athletes? What would be the efficiency, what would be the efficiency of these runners? What would be the RER of these runners throughout the 2-hour marathon? All of this sort of stuff. And what they found, and I can't remember the exact numbers, but they found that essentially women needed more exogenous carbohydrates in order to run a sub 2-hour marathon. And the reason is because they start with lower muscle and liver glycogen, because women are generally smaller than men, and their livers would be smaller, so they'd have smaller liver glycogen, and they have less lean muscle mass, so they would have less muscle glycogen to start as well. Men, a little bit lower, but still pretty high. I think it was like in women, it was like 110 to 120 grams of carbohydrates that they would need to ingest per hour. Whereas men, it was 90 to 100, something along those lines. So with that in mind, if we're sitting here thinking, oh, like the recommendations are normally 60 to 90 grams of carbohydrate per hour tops, that would lead to exhaustion in males and females well before that 26.2 mile mark actually is hit. So obviously it requires more research to be done, but just from a practical perspective, I can almost guarantee that guys like Eliud Kipchoge, Kelvin Kiptum, those very highly elite level marathoners who are actually, the closest to the 2-hour mark, are consuming much more than 90 grams of carbohydrate per hour. I don't know. Do you know if has anyone ever published the amount of carbohydrate that, say, like Eliud Kipchoge was intaking during the sub 2-hour attempt?
I have some insider information that I was told not to share.
Okay,
but I can tell you it's a lot.
Yeah, so we will. I need to get Brett Kirby on the podcast. And
that'd be a great guest. His work's excellent.
Yeah, no, Brett is one of my favorite people. I've had the pleasure of sitting down and talking to him. He's very much a systems physiologist, meaning that like he just takes everything into account. And to be able to coordinate, and during the Breaking 2 project, do you remember the time that Eliud got on the first Breaking 2 attempt?
201 something.
No, well, that was his world record that he got in Germany that year, right?
Oh, you mean like it was something right over 2 hours.
Yeah. So it was like the first time, with all like the, the best stuff, drafting, other things like that, he got really close to the 2-hour mark. And then they followed that up with the Ineos 159 project or something like that. And that's when they actually broke it. But that was, that's really just to show that it's actually possible. And now it's on, like those really high level runners to actually go and do it. And I would not be surprised if Eliud Kipchoge was able to intake 120 to 150 grams per hour and not have gastrointestinal issues, then that's probably what they're aiming for. But yeah, what was your take on that paper? I know it was pretty dense and it was a long one.
Yeah, I mean, I think exactly like how practical it is for most people. I think you mentioned, I don't know, but I think gave us a few key points that we went. Well, nowadays, a lot of people are running marathons at high enough intensities where we can push the amount of carbohydrates you're fueling with just because you're utilizing a lot of carbohydrates based on the intensity we can run marathons at now.
Mm-hmm.
So my main takeaways were that we can probably are undershooting the carbohydrate recommendations per hour, as you're alluding to. So I would definitely shoot for at least 90. And I think if you really want to push the pace and then break some of these records, but also just like individuals who are running somewhere in the 2 hour frame or low twos, now 2:10s, like I think you probably need to push the amount of carbohydrates you're taking per hour to support that kind of performance has been my main takeaway. That you definitely need at least 90.
Yeah, something that's stood out to me was this idea that females tend to need more exogenous carbohydrates compared to
Yeah, that
males.
was a really interesting takeaway. The differences between sexes as well too, which I think historically has been an issue. It's one of the issues in the sports in general is that most of the research has been in males, where like it's not from a biological standpoint exactly the same, and we need more female specific research. And this was a great paper to show that this could be an important difference. When we're talking about the differences in fueling strategies between males and females, females actually might need a little more based on how fast they're running.
Yeah, and I think, from the women I've talked to who are in endurance sport, the general consensus is that they need less carbohydrates because they're smaller, even though that's almost the exact opposite way. And I'm wondering if that's, amongst a lot of other issues, with women's sports being developed a little bit later than male sports, underrepresentation in terms of the research and those sort of things. I wonder if lower carbohydrate fueling is one of the reasons why we do have, a little bit more of those gaps in performance, especially with like the longer races. Because we do see as those races get longer and longer, women have a tendency to actually surpass the males and become, like the people standing on top of the podium.
Very interesting.
Yeah, so that was just something that I thought was interesting. Another thing that I really thought was interesting is that for every increase in 4 kilograms of body weight, it seems like women get a bigger benefit in terms of glycogen storage compared to men. So something I do want to just for the ladies listening out there, I know it's probably fairly small proportion of our of the audience, but for the ladies listening I have talked to quite a few, one of the recommendations or one of the big key takeaways I took from this is that strength training, especially lower body strength training and maybe gaining a little bit of muscle mass in your legs, could be very, very beneficial in terms of your ability to perform, from an efficiency standpoint, from a muscle glycogen storage standpoint, from a, just from a bone density standpoint, like all of these different things. And because you stand to gain more in terms of glycogen storage compared to male counterparts, if you gain more muscle mass in your legs, you're going to stand to extend that performance gap even more compared to your female counterparts that you're racing against. So women don't shy away from strength training, especially a little bit more of the heavy stuff. Maybe even some blocks of a little bit of hypertrophy training to gain a little bit of muscle mass. Those sort of things. It's really hard to gain muscle mass, but it's not a bad idea, to think about it. And this is just another one of those reasons, is that it could be beneficial for your glycogen storage as well.
Yeah, no, I think that was well said. Exactly. That's a really other interesting part of that paper as well. And I think that's an interesting way to connect it to some of the strength training stuff. I hadn't thought about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was just because I have been thinking a lot about like the strength training aspect of things. I was like, I wonder if that would be a good point to start to make to people.
It's interesting. I mean, obviously we don't have the literature to say like that's definitive, but it definitely could, like from a cross-reference standpoint, is interesting.
It's another one of those things where it's like, it's probably not going to hurt you as long as you're maintaining good form.
No, I think, especially with most of the females I work with, all the runners I work with, but a lot of the females too, because historically they've avoided strength training. We put a large emphasis on strength training with a particular focus is increasing muscle strength, muscle power, and we've seen a lot of benefits, not only as we started the conversation with, like from a durability standpoint, they can accumulate more training, they bounce back faster from training, but I just think for them having higher overall strength levels, then like each step, for example, each phase of gait is more of a submaximal contraction, which I think has a lot of benefits.
Yeah, that's exactly how I have always thought of strength training is like, if you increase your maximal strength, then each
Yeah,
step, each phase of gait is going to be a smaller percentage
yeah,
of that maximal. And
yeah.
you just
That's how
stand,
I think about it.
yeah,
Yeah, you think about like running, like there's different systems at play. One of the plays is obviously the neuromuscular system. It's hard to overload that neuromuscular system in running. Obviously, we can be a sprinting or like hill work, but the weight room's also a really potent stimulus to overload the neuromuscular system.
hmm
So that way, everything you do from a running standpoint is so maximal. I think there's something to be said for that.
yeah. Yeah, we'll have to get you back on and actually talk about, the implementation of strength training into the gym
Awesome.
because you're one
Love
of
to.
you're one of the people that I look to when I am looking for strength training ideas or
Appreciate
strength
that.
training tips, other things like that. So,
That's definitely an area I feel the most one of the areas I feel most confident in regard to translate that to running performance. But yeah,
yeah. Awesome, man. Well, I think we'll leave you guys with that one. I'll link to the sub 2 hour modeling paper that I talked about in the show notes. It is a doozy of a paper, but don't shy away from it. There are some really really good takeaways. I think the big takeaways from today are consistency, specificity, and progression. You need to stay consistent with your fueling. During your training, you need to be specific with the type of fueling that you're doing. So if you're trying to hit that 90 grams per hour mark, especially
yep,
during your races, you need to do that during your long runs, maybe during a few of the moderate sort of training runs that you're doing. And you need to progress it over time. You can't just start with 90 grams of carbohydrates or else you're going to, not have a fun time in terms of gastrointestinal stuff. But yeah, other
awesome.
than that, you guys know where to find me, Critical02 on Instagram. You can find Jonah at JAR_performance. Go over there. He is, he has really been doing well with explanation of running stuff lately, reels,
Appreciate
all
that.
that sort of stuff, science-backed running. So go check him out there. If you want a good running coach, I don't know if Jonah's taking on coaches and or athletes, but feel
Got a
free
few
to reach
spots
out to him.
left.
Yeah, he's
Awesome.
he really offers a really premium run or coaching experience for those that are looking for that sort of thing. I know I've had a couple of friends after Jonah was on the show reach out, and now he's coaching them as
Yeah.
athletes. So
So it's been a great funnel over, which I appreciate.
yeah, and it's Jonah, has been great catching up to you, man, or catching up with
Yeah,
you,
man.
man. Yeah, we'll definitely get you back on the show, and we'll catch you guys in the next one.